Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Traditionally, monogamy has been the form of romantic relationship which most people have been assumed to want to pursue. But there has recently been a growing tendency among some to question this assumption, and instead to pursue polyamorous or other forms of romantic attachment. And this tendency has been reflected in philosophical debates too. Some have gone so far as to question whether monogamous relationships can be defended at all, prompting others to think more deeply about what the distinctive value of monogamous relationships, if any, might be. I spoke to Luke Brunning, a lecturer in applied ethics at the Idea Centre, and we explored some of this fascinating ethical territory. So welcome to the podcast, Luke.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
You're interested in this question about romantic relationships and what sort of relationships people should be having. So what is it that's interesting about that question to you?
Oh, it's a huge area of interest for me, right? So I think the thing that animates me is this kind of underlying question of what a sort of good or flourishing relationship might look like, and in particular what personal traits or practices we want to have in order to bring it about. And I'm trying to think beyond a kind of overly simple dichotomy between kinds of relationships. So there's a lot of discussion of sort of monogamy versus non-monogamy versus relationship anarchy, or doing things in different kinds of ways. And I think a lot of people find that they've reached a kind of impasse with that debate.
Right.
They happy to say to themselves, look, kind of do what suits you, do what you want to do, or it kind of doesn't matter. Choose a form of romantic life that you want.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of interested in this question, well, what if my wants are in tension with what I feel able to do? What if I'm sort of mentally quite open to different possibilities, but find myself emotionally unable to kind of entertain them all in the same way? What if I find some of the kind of contemporary social norms about romantic life quite kind of challenging, or I wonder how they've affected my own character? So these are kind of some of the questions that I'm interested in.
Yeah. So part of that kind of broader context that you're interested in is, you know, the sort of social context in which relationships take place, right? So one reason people might think this topic is worth exploring is something like that they want to have an authentic relationship or a set of relationships, that they don't want to just fall into the patterns that are set out for them by society and just do what's expected of them. And that's why people might give thought to kind of unconventional forms of relationship, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. So like for me, one of the purposes of philosophy, not the only one, is to try and sort of reconcile ourselves to our social world, to help us understand the social inheritance that we have. And I think with romantic life, it's a particularly urgent and complicated challenge because the norms that govern romantic behavior and the kind of common practices are quite strong and entrenched. And they're often things that we are not really fully aware of until we try and resist them or until we challenge them. And they structure our lives in these radical ways. And I think a lot of people, even if they ultimately want to pursue a relatively traditional form of romantic life, they still want to start thinking a bit more actively about what to do, what's right for them. And beyond the question of, well, should I have a monogamous relationship or a non-monogamous one? There's a whole host of questions about what kind of person should I try to be? What kind of person is a good romantic partner? What kinds of practices can I build and maintain with my partners within the relationship that I have that will help that relationship flourish?
Right.
And those are particularly urgent questions that I think for lots of people, because they're increasingly challenging ways in which social norms and institutions might be oppressive or have historically oppressive aspects, particularly for women and other minorities.
Yeah.
And people are concerned about the ways in which intimate life can reflect and sort of amplify those forms of oppression as well. Right,
yeah. So you said before you don't want to be restricted to just talking about the forms of relationship that we have, and that kind of ground has been well trodden. And that actually the conclusions might be as much to do with how we should approach the relationships that we have, and what we should be trying to put into those relationships and get out of those relationships, and not just kind of and approaching those relationships in a sort of conscious and informed way, perhaps. But I suppose one way in which we might get to that is by thinking about alternative forms of relationships that we might have, right? So even if we do end up with, a traditional monogamous relationship, at least having thought through the alternatives, we might have a slightly more informed approach to that relationship.
Yes, that's right. So there's a kind of quite common sense idea in which we want to think about the options available to us before making a decision. That's something that lots of people are kind of starting to realize now. But I kind of want to challenge in a way, or slightly challenge or push against a discourse of sort of compatibility, which I think runs through this, right? This idea that what we need to do is identify what we want and then find someone who wants the same thing and sort of put it into action, as if we can kind of foreclose all the hard work in advance by just correctly identifying what we want. I mean, I guess I'm interested in the possibility that what we want, what we may be able to do or find our emotions inclined towards, may not align. And I think that's a real possibility, particularly at the moment where lots of people are challenging traditional forms of romantic life, or at least open to experimenting, but find that for reasons often outside their control, they struggle with doing so. And so the question is, well, what should they do? And how should they approach it? And I think that for me is the kind of complicated middle ground and the important question. The sort of person that's already inclined to think, I can see why people might want to maybe have a non-monogamous relationship. I can understand that, but that's not something for me, or it's definitely something I couldn't do. And so thinking about how such people should proceed and what we might be able to do and how to think about that question.
Yeah. It's interesting what you said about a discourse of compatibility. Do you think that's kind of, or that way of thinking about relationships is partly driven by the kind of technology through which a lot of people are trying to find romantic partners, and that we're kind of driven to, through dating apps and so on, to kind of set out exactly what we want from a relationship, and then we're going to find somebody who wants exactly the same thing, and then everything will be great because we're perfectly compatible, and that's not really how it works in the real world.
I think it's complicated. So I think technology is reflecting and amplifying an existing trend. And I think the trend is one we have to treat with care, because there is a sense in which finding someone with similar values and interests to you is a good thing.
Yeah.
And historically, I think the drive towards compatibility matters a lot in the context of people whose design interests were historically ignored or overlooked or not seen as particularly important, right? So if you're a woman, for example, whose kind of wider interests and values, your sort of sexual identity, your imagination, these aspects of your personality might have been ignored or sort of downvalued by society at the expense of other social roles that you may occupy. There's a sense in which people are rightly trying to pursue the things which give their lives meaning.
Yes.
The aspect of the compatibility discourse that I'm concerned about is the idea that we oversimplify that question to some extent, but also that emphasis on finding the right person attempts to kind of foreclose the difficulties. Like, if only we just go through this really long process of searching and we refine our filters enough and we screen out all of these people and we ask the right questions, we can find the right person, the person for me, and sort of that's it, we're done. The difficult stuff is done and we get on with the relationship.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, I'm very much interested in the idea that the relationship is where the difficulty begins, and that this question of compatibility is a sort of ongoing concern, and we need to think more about the kinds of agency which emerge and can be enhanced but also undermined within relationships themselves. So there's a sense in which obviously finding a compatible partner is an obviously good thing to do.
Yeah.
But emphasizing that at the expense of everything else, I think, is sometimes problematic.
Yeah. So you're particularly interested in this question of agency. So interested in the way that certain kinds of relationships might be conducive towards or might undermine agency. And as you've just said, perhaps part of the way part of this whole approach to romantic relationships might be motivated by the way in which certain people's agency has been systematically undermined in the past, right? So it seems like whatever we come out with, we ought to think about how conducive it is towards our agency. So we'll come back to that question of agency in a bit, I think, but I just wanted to kind of raise this sort of question of monogamy, which is a central one in this debate, so it's hard to avoid kind of discussing it to some extent. So there is a kind of challenge that people have made to monogamous relationships, and some people have been as strong as to say actually monogamous relationships are morally impermissible, right? They're not the kind of thing that one should be doing. They're morally wrong in some sense. Is that right?
You're right that people often do want to challenge monogamy, and particularly its kind of socially entrenched status. And I think those two things have to be separated. So some critics are concerned about the kind of social predominance given to this way of romantic life, right? They don't really think there's anything necessarily wrong with monogamy as such, but the sense that this is the only socially recognizable relationship, the only form of relationship that might be recognized by the state and so on, is concerning to some people. I think other people, though, want to push the argument a bit further and think that, there looks to be something inherently troubling about monogamous relationships.
Right.
So some people in the literature have kind of tried to develop this line of argument. And I think they are animated by this worry that, in trying to pursue a monogamous relationship with somebody, or in trying to form such a relationship around a promise or a commitment, right, to exclude other people, to forego other people, and to expect one's partner to do the same.
Yeah.
Some people think that's morally impermissible. So some of those arguments hinge on views about promises. So Halle Liberto, for example, is concerned about those kinds of commitments. They seem to involve a promise which she thinks cannot be accepted, because it's a promise which seeks to extend itself over a sort of domain of one's life and other people's life over which we shouldn't have control. Okay. So the intimate life. And so she has a kind of an interesting and complicated argument, and it rests on a thought about sexual promises in general. So she thinks it would be morally wrong for us to hold someone to a promise to have sex with us.
Yes.
And she says, well, likewise by that, actually, the inverse is true as well. So sort of monogamy promises or promises not to have sex with people, she thinks would be wrong. There's just the wrong kind of thing to be promised over.
Okay.
So that's a kind of view about promises. There's a kind of another view that other people have, people like Harry Chalmers, and they seem to be worried about the kinds of restriction involved in monogamy. Mm-hmm. And in particular, their argument seems to be something like monogamy involves an attempt to restrict a partner's access to valuable things, so forms of romantic intimacy, which are human goods that make lives go well. It's an attempt to restrict their access to those things without any kind of corresponding and thus justifying benefits. Yeah. And so the strategy that these people explore in the literature is to canvass possible benefits, right? So they think, what might people say in favor of monogamy? So they might say, well, it's a really good way of avoiding sexually transmitted disease, or it's a really good way of avoiding jealousy, or it's a really great way of having a practical life as opposed to a kind of chaotic life. Yeah. And then they'll argue against these things one by one and show, well, actually, non-monogamous people are often much more acutely aware of their sexual health than monogamous people, and that jealousy is very frequent in monogamous relationships, perhaps more so because of the efforts to exclude others, or that this whole idea of practicality is something that cuts across both monogamous and non-monogamous lives. Like both you can be a chaotic person irrespective of who you are. Right. So the argumentative strategy is to kind of say, look, when we look at it closely, monogamy doesn't seem to really give us any distinct benefits, but it's asking us to exclude all of these rich and important goods, which lots of people think are good for them and help their lives flourish. Right. And so it seems unjustified. That's the kind of worry that they have.
Yeah. So the example that's in Harry Chalmers that's been quite influential is this comparison with friendship. So the thought is that monogamy is a bit like having a friendship with another person, where one condition of the friendship is that the person won't engage in any friendships with any other people. So you're restricting their access to friendship and to the various goods that come from friendship. And most of us, I think, have the intuition that there's something wrong with doing that. But whether we think there's something morally wrong with doing that is perhaps a bit less obvious. So, I mean, one response to that case is just to say, well, you know, that a monogamous relationship, and by comparison, the kind of friendship that Harry Chalmers is describing, it's something which is entered into by consenting adults, right? So it's a deal that's made between two adults. And really, what business is it of ours what kinds of agreements people make between each other, right? So it's not that you're imposing the restrictions on the other person. What you're doing is you're mutually agreeing that you will both restrict your own lives in that kind of way. And as long as you are happy to do that, then why should anybody else be concerned about it? And why should we worry about whether it's morally wrong or not? But I suppose what you might think about the friendship case is not that it's morally wrong. Even if you don't want to go as far as to say that it's morally wrong, there's still something kind of unhealthy about it, right? And if you did want to defend monogamy, you would want to say something a bit more than just it's what people want to do. Because if you want to, you know, going back to what we were saying at the start, if people want to have a kind of conscious, informed, thoughtful approach to their romantic relationships, they ought to have something a bit more to say about what the value of that particular form of relationship is, rather than just, I want to do it, therefore it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge, I think, to people who want to say there's something important and distinctly valuable about monogamy, is to kind of identify what that is. And I think it's when you actually start to think about it, it's quite difficult to pin it down, because many of the things that people will mention are things that are shared in many other kinds of relationship. So there's this kind of like, what's the difference-making feature of monogamy? So, you know, Chalmers just thinks there isn't something there that can do the work. And I think we need to think kind of carefully about the conclusions we want to draw. So your suggestion is, look, like, it can seem strange. You said it was unhealthy. You might just think it's a bit strange to have these restrictions, but there is an open question about whether, you know, we should be allowed, morally permitted to make strange decisions with people. And I think most people would want to say, you know, yes, of course, like, if it's a true free agreement between myself and my partner to have this restriction, then yeah, sure, we might be missing out. We might be missing out on things of real importance, but there's nothing inherently wrong with missing out. People miss out in all aspects of their lives in virtue of committing to any course of action. They're not able to do something else. And so what's the status of the claim that we're making? Now, we might notice that it's sort of permissible to have these restrictions, but still question whether it's conducive to our flourishing or sort of make for a good life. And I think that's the area where our intuitions are kind of activated by this example. I think most people think it's permissible. So they disagree perhaps with the conclusion that Chalmers puts in that particular article you're thinking about. But they still think it's not conducive to flourishing, right, in some way. A sort of openness to the possibility of further friends is important. And I think you might want to say, and this is perhaps where the example might start to break down, that there's actually a distinction between friendship and other kinds of relationships, right? You might think that a sort of openness in general to the possibility of having other friends is sort of constitutive of being a friend to somebody.
Right.
What it means to be a friend is that you're the kind of person who's sensitive to and able to interact with other people, who's not going to arbitrarily exclude them, and so on, right? And we can question whether that's true, though, of romantic relationships. And now we risk sort of arguing in circles. So the kind of advocate of monogamy will say, well, that's got nothing to do with romantic life. Like, in fact, central to romantic life is this idea of excluding other people, right? So one argument that they might want to develop is to try and say, well, that form of exclusion is somehow built into romantic love. That friendship is not the same as a romantic loving relationship, because romantic love is involved. Romantic love is inherently excluding of other people. doesn't seem to be a great argument, because lots of people just claim that's not true. I mean, so lots of non-monogamous people just say it's just not true that you can love only one person at a time.
Yes.
And if it was true, I assume we wouldn't have the romantic love triangle as a kind of core feature of a lot of literature and film as well, right? Even if we don't think of that as non-monogamous.
There's a way in which that's kind of begging the question to say it's built into the idea of romantic love that it's exclusionary. Well, someone can just say, well, not for me, it isn't.
Exactly. It's not particularly productive, right? Like, I think, and so I think that the literature around this topic has moved to a point now where lots of people are saying, look, like, we're not going to presuppose that romantic love is inherently exclusionary. It looks like you can love multiple people at one time. So, like, what's the benefit of just loving one person at a time? And again, it's hard to kind of pin down any distinct, unique benefits.
Right.
I think for me, I'm interested in exploring this idea that those forms of exclusion that are typical to monogamous relationships, so sort of excluding the emotional impact of other people on our romantic lives, or foregoing sexual contact with other people, they may play an important role in facilitating and kind of maintaining our very ability to be intimate with anyone at all. And I think this is the position lots of people find themselves in, which is that they are kind of open-minded and they think this is totally permissible for people to have a non-monogamous form of life, but they worry that they would feel very jealous or insecure or uncertain. And for lots of people, their ability to be intimate with other people, so their ability to engage in a romantic relationship, perhaps have sex with somebody, be open to that possibility in the way that they'd really like, that might require them to have a situation in which they can be reasonably sure that their partner's excluding other people, or that's not something they have to deal with a lot of the time. Right? So it's sort of an exclusion that helps benefit them romantically. Now, it's not an exclusion that they think is sort of necessary in and of itself, or is kind of this amazing, wonderful feature.
Right.
It's an exclusion which helps them preserve their ability to be intimate.
Right.
And I guess one of the kind of troubling possibilities here is that ability to be intimate is obviously shaped by our social world, right? So the kind of context we're brought up with, the exemplars that we run into in our family and in people in society, the social norms that we kind of grow up within, the ideals that we have. And lots of those things are obviously promoting or sort of pushing a kind of vision of monogamous happiness, right?
Yes.
So we're kind of habituated into a monogamous society.
Yes.
And so there is this kind of underlying question of, do we need these exclusions to protect our agency simply because we're born into a kind of society that has a certain shape? And part of me thinks, that's part of the answer here, right? And then the question is, well, so isn't this talk of agency and kind of the possibility that monogamy might just help us be able to be intimate in a society that is quite hostile to non-monogamy? Isn't that just defending the status quo, right? Aren't we sort of stuck in this position where we're kind of molded into wanting monogamous relationships? Why is that? Well, because the alternative is it makes us feel so insecure that we can't pursue it.
Yeah.
It looks like we're kind of trapped. And this is a real point of tension in my own work, trying to kind of think around that possibility. So the possibility that we can be habituated or shaped by a society in a way that we don't like. I mean, that kind of pins us or reduces our options on the one hand, and yet cognitively, in terms of what we believe or what we think, we can outrun those options. We can entertain all kinds of other possibilities, and we can come to strongly want those other possibilities. So I could be somebody who's very insecure, but I strongly want a polyamorous relationship, for example. The question is, what do I do in that situation? And how far should we sort of embrace the status quo? And I think for me, we need to be a little bit more attentive to the kind of tragic possibility that we are constrained by a society that shapes us in a way that we don't approve, but which we can't control.
Really interesting. So that raises a few different thoughts. I suppose there's one kind of broad question is this another instance of the kind of fundamental conflict between people who kind of have a liberal approach to morality, who might think, well, we just take people's preferences as they are, and what we should do is protect people's ability to kind of fulfill whatever those preferences are. And other people who might kind of critique that approach and say, well, but those preferences are shaped by social forces, right? And it might be that those preferences could be improved in a way which is more conducive to human flourishing or the good life if we challenge those social forces rather than just kind of take the results of those social forces as read. So do you think that's right? Is that what's going on here?
That is right, in a certain sense.
Right.
So I think the view that we need to be careful to avoid is one where we get so kind of enwrapped in the possibility of challenging social norms that we forget that we have to have relationships ourselves. Okay. Now, it's definitely one thing to challenge a social norm and to come out and say, look, the way that marriage, for example, or monogamous relationships have been supported by the state at the expense of other kinds of valuable relationships, that's problematic, and I want to challenge that. So we can say that, and we should think about that and campaign for that as well. Yeah. But as individuals, we face the question, well, what kind of relationships do I want to have?
Yeah.
And that question, I think, is one that has to be approached with a large degree of realism. And it could be a tragic realism. I mean, the possibility here is that we find that we've grown up in a particular social context, drinking a diet of, particular romantic norms and ideals, and that we really struggle to kind of have a relationship of the kind that we're sort of intellectually accepting of.
Yeah.
And then the question is, well, what should we do about this? Now, some people think, look, that sucks, but you've got to kind of push through and try harder to kind of get to the ideal state, right? If you really think that, I don't know, radical polyamory or relationship anarchy is kind of morally okay or preferable, then you should walk the walk and kind of get to that point.
Yeah.
I worry about that attitude. I think that neglects the real fragile nature of romantic agency, and that's something that needs to be kind of carefully nurtured, which can develop over time, and which is fundamentally relational. So it's held in place by other people and can be really undermined by other people. Yeah. And so a lot of kind of concern about sort of alternative romantic communities or ways of life is that, on paper, these things are morally acceptable, and no one's denying that. But the ways that they're enacted can often be quite difficult for people who were brought up in a monogamous culture.
Right.
And those are the people that I have in mind. I'm really interested in thinking about what should someone who's sort of open-minded but unsure and sort of thinks that they are, habituated into a kind of monogamous-y character, like how should they proceed? And I think that's the hard question. And it's a question that sort of advocates of either side, as it were, kind of overlook in a quest for sort of a purity of thought about the issue. Yeah.
And your particular focus in your work is, or one particular focus of your work is on agency and the way in which certain kinds of relationships, but also certain approaches to relationships and, things that we might do within relationships can either be conducive towards agency or undermine agency. So could you say a bit more about what you mean by agency in this sense?
So when I'm thinking about agency, I'm just thinking about our underlying abilities to be romantic people. Right. So this is the ability to be intimate with another person, to form a romantic relationship, to engage in sexual activity, to talk about these aspects of our lives with people, to have a sense of kind of self-awareness, ownership over the kinds of stories that we tell with ourselves and with our partners about these aspects of our lives. So why does this matter? Well, I think that the focus on agency is important when contrasted with what you mentioned earlier, our preferences or our desires. Because there can be situations where our desires kind of clash with our abilities. And there's sort of no point in wanting something that we are unable to pursue in any meaningful sense, particularly when that involves other people. So I'm trying to think more about agency in romantic life and how that agency can be supported, how it can be undermined, how it seems to function. And my understanding of it is one that tries to situate it in a relational context. So it's not just that we sort of develop the ability to be romantic people and get on with it.
Yes.
Right. That you sort of do, you learn the skill and then you apply it. It's very much something that we learn on the job, in connection with other people. Right. And which makes us inherently vulnerable because that person's input can be positive or it could be very negative. Mm-hmm. And I think for many people, actually, those inputs are often quite negative. So it's something that develops in this relational context. It can be sustained over time in a good way, but it can also be undermined. It can be improved. And it's something that's quite fragile as a consequence of that, right? So, an instance of assault or an instance of somebody gaslighting you or not supporting you, or all of these things can radically undermine people's general ability to be intimate, irrespective of what they want. They might want to have a certain kind of relationship and find that actually when it comes down to it, they really struggle with it on the day-to-day. They could want to be a great communicator, but find they're really terrible at communicating. They don't have these kind of abilities to do so. And obviously, romantic agency isn't this kind of modular unit of human psychology that has no relationship to how we are in other aspects of our lives. I'm not claiming that. It's just a way of sort of packaging and describing what goes on in these contexts. And one of the motivating thoughts behind that is simply that we can be pretty good at other aspects of our lives, but still not be very good as romantic partners. It's an area of life that's often deemed to be private. People don't talk about very much. When they talk about it, they don't talk about the minutiae in ways that are easy to understand. And so we're always kind of learning from our relationships. And we're always, in a sense, butting up against the ways in which relationships are portrayed in wider society as well. Yeah. And as a result, people often encounter and experience in very visceral ways a sense of dissonance between those things, right? That their own experiences don't match up with what they're expecting or how relationships are portrayed and so on. So there's this kind of ongoing practical question, which is like, what is it to be a romantic person? How am I to have a romantic relationship? What does this involve? What does a flourishing romantic relationship look like? And that's a sort of a general question, but also there's the particular question of, well, what does it look like for me and the people that I'm relating to? And that's the kind of framework that I really want to focus on. And it's a point of emphasis. So I'm not saying that thinking about what we want is unimportant, or thinking about compatibility of value is unimportant. Instead, I'm thinking that there can be cases where having one eye on romantic agency acts as a constraint. It might inject a dose of realism in our thinking about this. We might think, look, I really sort of fantasize about living in some kind of, romantic commune with loads of partners and, raising goats in the countryside. But realistically, I know that actually I'm not very good at communicating openly. I feel pretty insecure some of the time. I don't really want to have to put in a lot of work emotionally every day, talking to different people about these things. And so, that's an aspect of my kind of character, which means that what suits me romantically and what supports my agency might be a much more sort of exclusive situation, or having one romantic partner that I spend a lot of time with or that I share a house with. So that's the kind of thinking. It's sort of putting agency in the picture and thinking about the ways in which it may be in tension with desire. And I just want to say this is a tension that can have unexpected results. You could be somebody who really, really wants to live a radical life and realizes that you can't. But alternatively, you could be somebody that really wants to live the life that your parents had. That could be something you really desire. But actually, a realistic appreciation of your character, the kinds of agency that would best sustain your romantic life, would reveal actually that you're not necessarily somebody that's well suited to that. That actually you find it very easy to form close romantic bonds with people. That you don't find that sexual exclusivity is particularly important. You find that actually reflecting on what makes you feel good, what makes you flourish, what makes you sort of feel secure in your relationships is precisely that you're not excluding other people or trying to close off the possibility of meeting someone else or going on a date or something. Right. And that could be quite an awkward confrontation because it might clash with what you want, or it might clash with what you sort of grew up expecting you would have. Yeah. And so those kind of realizations might be quite challenging, where people sort of struggle to see that they're not always able to do the things that they want to do.
Okay, really interesting. Could you say a bit more about the ways in which these different forms of relationships might be undermining or might contribute towards agency in the sense that you're interested in there?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So like this is I guess a point of tension in my work at the moment is to try and, on the one hand, recognize that all relationships are different and all people are different.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to make sweeping generalizations. But I'm also interested in the possibility that sort of different romantic configurations might have distinct benefits. So one thought here, it concerns non-monogamy. So we might want to think in a very general way, well, how might non-monogamy benefit somebody? And I guess one thought is that it increases your resources. I mean, this is a point lots of people have made in the literature, right? But there's a sense in which the more intimate partners that you have, the more intimate resources you have. And that can be understood very broadly. So sometimes we're talking about money, sometimes we're talking about time, childcare, having another pair of eyes around. But we could also talk about things that bring you satisfaction. So you might want lots of sex in your life, or you might be somebody that really wants to talk a lot and to kind of talk through your feelings or to kind of process various events in your life, and that having more partners allows you to talk more than you would otherwise be with somebody.
Without boring one person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of very basic and obvious sense in which, for some people, having more resource improves their lives. But I guess that's, again, very contingent. There's a question whether there's anything sort of inherently different about non-monogamy. And one possibility that I'm exploring is whether there's a kind of structural, whether it's sort of structurally advantageous to be non-monogamous when it comes to things like accountability and cooperation.
Right.
So non-monogamous people can obviously talk to friends and family about their relationships, but they often don't, or those conversations are often things that are breached at times of crisis, or often relatively superficial and so on. But there's also a sense in which those other individuals don't often feature in the kind of day-to-day deliberation, conversation, decision-making about romantic life.
Right.
One thought is that, well, if there's more than one partner involved, there's a kind of structural nod towards increased accountability, right? If you're somebody that has, two relationships with person A and person B, and you're sort of not necessarily living together or talking about every aspect of every relationship with each person, but they both know you, they know what you're like as a partner, they might not know a little bit about, what's going on with the other person. You've got more people there to kind of hold you accountable, hold each other accountable, more people to whom each person has to be accountable. And so there's a sense in which it might be beneficial for us. The analogy that I sometimes draw, and I don't know if this is a good analogy, is with a kind of tripartite separation of powers in a political system, right? So we've got these different branches of the political system, all kind of holding each other accountable, holding each other in check. And that's something that seems to happen when we have these three branches. It's harder for any one branch to kind of dominate the other branch. And so that's one thought. Maybe that's something that is a real structural difference between non-monogamous and monogamous relationships. Quite whether that's a big difference, whether there are complications we want to explore, I don't know. But so I'm trying to think about that as a possibility. I think earlier we touched upon the difficulty of sort of pinning down distinct benefits to monogamy as such. I think there are some things to be said about this. So, for example, we might think that commitment to certain projects requires a certain kind of exclusion of other projects just because of the nature of the project involved. We might think that other people help us refine and kind of specify what it is we value. So we might think that we have very general values, but that in relationships with people, those values take on a much more fine-grained and determinate form.
Yeah.
And so we might think that practically speaking, it can be very difficult to have one value kind of interpreted and filled in by different people at the same time without leading to kind of practical tensions down the line. So there might be various things that we can say about this. The other thing is just to say that we might think that various kinds of exclusionary romantic life where we're kind of saying, oh, we're going to limit ourselves to one person as a kind of contingent fact, given our social setup, help maintain our agency. Whether we think that's a good thing or bad thing, if we think the social setup is bad, for many people, they might think, look, I just feel a lot more comfortable, a lot more secure, a lot less worry if I just have one partner. That's enough for me. And so we might think, well, monogamy has that advantage in the current situation, that we're just kind of habituated towards it in that way.
Yes. Okay. Well, we're nearly running out of time, but I just wanted to ask one final question, which is kind of, it's probably a bit unfair, but do you have a personal view on whether, kind of all things considered, one form of relationship is better than the other? Because it seems like a lot of the things you say about monogamy are, while they're kind of defending why some people might want to have monogamous relationships, it's still sort of framed as, well, if you're unable to avail yourself of the various benefits of non-monogamous relationships, or you're insecure in various ways, or you're kind of, your preferences are very much shaped by the social norms of the society you're brought up in, then it might be better for you to have a monogamous relationship. But it seems as though implicit in that is the view that, kind of all told, you'd be better off not being monogamous if you didn't have these various kind of limitations. Is that a fair characterization? Or
I think it's a good question for me to have to consider, right? It's a good potential criticism. I guess for me, I'd want to just say the onus is on the other side, right? Like, if you think that romantic relationships and the kind of intimacy within them and the emotional connections and the kind of sexual connections are good things, I would sort of say, well, I need a clear sense of why restricting those things it makes them better, makes them longer lasting or anything like that. I mean, empirically, obviously, that doesn't seem to be true. Lots of monogamous relationships break up very quickly. Long sort of the kind of ideal that people have of a long-lasting relationship seems increasingly rare. So, like, empirically, monogamy isn't this kind of success story, right? So the question is, well, what are the values that people are missing out when they're failing to do it in real life? And I'm not saying that flippantly. I think it is a genuine challenge to point to things that are distinctly valuable. I think that what is valuable about these relationships is valuable about other relationships. And the challenge, obviously, for the person that thinks monogamy is to explain what it is about a long-term committed relationship with one and only one person that doesn't also apply to a long-term committed exclusive relationship between three people. Right. So that's a case where they don't have an emotional bond with anyone else, they're not sleeping with anyone else. Similar commitment for it to be long-lasting and presumptively permanent, and so on and so forth. What are the differences, relevant differences? I think that's the challenge, to kind of pinpoint the thing that makes the difference in those cases. And people might talk about jealousy and practicality and organization. All of these, these are human things, right? That we worry about, but they don't seem to make a distinct difference.
Great. Okay, I think we'll have to leave it at that. So, Luke Brunning, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much too.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.